The room again shot up, and nothing has happened from that day to this. Another strange story comes from the same town. When I was on a visit to a friend in Port Tarlington, writes a lady in the Journal of American SPR, a rather unpleasant incident occurred to me. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, I woke up suddenly, for apparently no reason whatever. However, I quite distinctly heard snoring coming from under or in the bed in which I was lying. It continued for about 10 minutes, during which time I was absolutely limp with fright. The door opened, and my friend entered the bedroom, saying, "I thought you might want me, so I came in." Needless to say, I hailed the happy inspiration that sent her to me. I then told her what I had heard, and then, to comfort me, she said, "Oh, never mind, it is only grandfather. He died in this room, and his snoring is heard every night at 2 o'clock, the hour at which he passed away." Some time previously, a German gentleman was staying with his family. They asked him in the morning how he had slept, and he replied that he was disturbed by a snoring in the room, but he supposed it was the cat. A lady formerly resident of Queen's County, but who now lives near Dublin, sends the following clear and concise account of her own personal experience in a haunted house. Some years ago, my father, mother, sister, and myself went to live in a nice but rather small house close to the town of Blank in Queen's County. We liked the house, as it was conveniently and pleasantly situated, and we certainly never had a thought of ghost or haunted houses, nor would my father allow any talk of such things in his presence. But we were not long settled there when we were disturbed by the opening of the parlor door every night regularly at the hour of 11 o'clock. My father and mother used to retire to the room about 10 o'clock, while my sister and I used to sit up reading. We always declared that we would retire before the door opened, but we generally got so interested in our books that we would forget until we would hear the handle of the door turn and see the door flung open. We tried in every way to account for this, but we could find no explanation, and there was no possibility of any human agent being at work. Some time after, light was shown on the subject. We had visitors staying with us, and in order to make room for them, my sister was asked to sleep in the parlor. She consented without a thought of ghosts and went to sleep quite happily. But during the night she was awakened by someone opening the door, walking across the room and disturbing the fire irons. She supposed it to be the servant, called her by name, but got no answer. Then the person seemed to come away from the fireplace and walk out of the room. There was a fire in the grate, but though she heard the footsteps, she could see no one. The next thing was that I was coming downstairs, and as I glanced toward the hall door, I saw standing by it a man in a gray suit. I went out to my father and told him. He asked in surprise who let him in, and as the servants were out, he himself had already locked, bolted, and chained the door an hour previously. None of us had let him in, and when my father went out to the hall, the man had disappeared, and the door was as he had left it. Some little time after, I had a visit from a lady who knew the place well, and in the course of conversation she said, "This is the house poor Mr. Blank used to live in." "Who is Mr. Blank?" I asked. "Did you never hear of him?" she replied. "He was a minister who used to live in this house quite alone, and was murdered in this very parlor. His landlord used to visit him sometimes, and one night he was seen coming in about 11 o'clock and was seen leaving again about 5 o'clock in the morning. When Mr. Blank did not come out as usual, the door was forced open and he was found lying dead in this room by the fender, with his head battered in with a poker." We left the house soon after as our informant. The following weird incident occurred, apparently in the county Kilkenny, to a Miss K.B. during the two visits paid by her to Ireland in 1880 and 1881. The house in which she experienced the following was really an old barrack, long disused, very old-fashioned, and surrounded by a high wall. It was said that it had been built during the time of Cromwell as a stronghold for his men. The only inhabitants of this were Captain C., a retired officer in charge of the place, Mrs. C., 3 daughters, and 2 servants. They occupied the central part of the building, and the mess room being their drawing room. Miss K.B.'s bedroom was very lofty, and adjoined the other two, which were occupied by the 3 daughters E., G., and L. "The first recollection I have of anything strange," writes Miss B., "was that each night I was awakened about 3 o'clock by a tremendous noise, apparently in the next suite of rooms, which was empty, and it sounded as if some huge iron boxes and other heavy things were being thrown about with great force. This continued for about half an hour, when in the room underneath the kitchen I heard the fire being violently poked and raked for several minutes, and this was immediately followed by a most terrible and distressing cough of a man, very loud and violent. It seemed as if the exertion had brought on a paroxysm which he could not stop. In large houses in Kilkenny the fires are not lighted every day, owing to the slow burning property of the coal, and it is only necessary to rake it up every night about 11 o'clock, and in the morning it is still bright and clear. Consequently, I wondered why it was necessary for Captain C to get up in the middle of the night to stir it so violently. A few days later Mrs. B said to E and C, "I hear such strange noises every night. Are there any people in the adjoining part of the building?" She turned very pale and was looking earnestly at Miss B and said, "Oh, Kay, I am so sorry you heard. I hoped no one but myself had heard it. I would have given worlds to have spoken to you last night, but dared not move or speak." KB laughed at her for being so superstitious, but E declared that the place was haunted, and told her of a number of weird things that had been seen and heard. In the following year, 1881, Miss KB paid another visit to the barrack. This time there were only two other visitors there, a colonel and his wife. They occupied Miss B's former room, while to her was allotted a huge bedroom on the top of the house, with a long corridor leading to it. Opposite to this was another large room, which was occupied by the girls. Her strange experiences commenced again. One morning, about 4 o'clock, I was awakened by a very noisy martial footstep ascending the stairs, and then marching quickly up and down the corridor outside my room. Then suddenly the most violent coughing took place that I ever heard, which continued for some time, while the quick, heavy step continued its march. At last the footsteps faded away in the distance, and I then recalled to mind the same coughing after exertion last year. In the morning at breakfast, she asked both Captain C and the colonel had they been walking about, but both denied, and also said that they had no cough. The family looked very uncomfortable, and afterwards E came up with tears in her eyes and said, "Okay, please don't say anything more about that dreadful coughing. We all hear it often, especially when anything terrible is about to happen." Some nights later, the C's gave us a dance. When the guest had departed, Miss B went to her bedroom. The moon was shining so beautifully that I was really able to read my Bible by its light, and had let the Bible open on the window-sill, which was a very high one, and on which I sat to read, having had to climb the washstand to reach it. I went to bed and fell asleep, but was not long so when I was suddenly awakened by the strange feeling that someone was in the room. I opened my eyes and turned round, and saw on the window-sill in the moonlight a very long, very thin, very dark figure bending over the Bible, and apparently earnestly scanning the page. As if my movement disturbed the figure, it suddenly darted up, jumped off the window ledge onto the washstand and then to the ground, and flitted quietly across the room to the table where my jewelry was. That was the last she saw of it. She thought it was someone trying to steal her jewelry, so waited till morning, but nothing was missing. In the morning she described to one of the daughters, G, what she had seen, and the latter told her that something always happened when that appeared. Miss KB adds that nothing did happen. Later on she was told that a colonel had cut his throat in that very room. Another military station, Charles Fort, near Kinsale, has long had the reputation of being haunted. An account of this was sent to the Wide World magazine, January 1908, by Major H. L. Raquin, D.S.O. He states that he took it from a manuscript written by Captain Marvel Hall about the year 1880. Further information on the subject of the haunting is to be found in Dr. Craig's Real Pictures of Clerical Life in Ireland. Charles Fort was erected in 1667 by the Duke of Ormond. It is said to be haunted by a ghost known as the White Lady, and the traditional account of the reason for this haunting is briefly as follows. Shortly after the erection of the fort, a Colonel Warrender, a severe disciplinarian, was appointed its governor. He had a daughter who bore the quaint Christian name of Wilful. She became engaged to a Sir Trevor Ashurst, and subsequently married him. On the evening of their wedding day, the bride and bridegroom were walking on the battlements, when she espied some flowers growing on the rocks beneath. She expressed a wish for them. and a sentry posted close by volunteered to climb down for them, provided Sir Trevor took his place during his absence. He assented and took the soldier's coat and musket while he went in search of a rope. Having obtained one, he commenced his descent, but the task proving longer than he expected, Sir Trevor fell asleep. Meantime, the governor visited his sentries, as was his custom, and in the course of his rounds came to where Sir Trevor was asleep. He challenged him, and on receiving no answer perceived that he was asleep, whereupon he drew a pistol and shot him through the heart. The body was brought in, and it was only then the governor realized what had happened. The bride, who appears to have gone indoors before the tragedy occurred, then learned the fate that befell her husband, and in her distraction rushed from the house and flung herself from the battlements. In despair at the double tragedy, her father shot himself during the night. The above is from Dr. Craig's book already alluded to. In the Wide World magazine, the legend differs slightly in details. According to this, the governor's name was Brown, and it was his own son, not his son-in-law, that he shot, while the incident is said to have occurred over 150 years ago. The White Lady is the ghost of the young bride. Let us see what accounts there are for her appearance. A good many years ago, Fort Major Black, who had served in the Peninsular War, gave his own personal experiences to Dr. Craig. He stated that he had gone to the hall door one summer evening and saw a lady entering the door and going up the stairs. At first he thought she was the officer's wife, but as he looked on, he observed she was dressed in white, and in a very old-fashioned style. Impelled by curiosity, he hastened upstairs after her and followed her closely into one of the rooms, but on entering it he could not find the slightest trace of anyone there. On another occasion he stated that two sergeants were packing some cast stores. One of them had his little daughter with him, and the child suddenly exclaimed, "Who is that white lady who is bending over the banisters and looking down at us?" The two men looked up, but could see nothing. But the child insisted that she had seen a lady in white looking down and smiling at her. On another occasion a staff officer, a married man, was residing in the governor's house. One night, as the nurse lay awake, she and the children were in a room which opened into what is known as the White Lady's apartment. She suddenly saw a lady clothed in white glide to the bedside of the youngest child, and after a little place her hand upon its wrist. At this the child started in its sleep and cried out, "Oh, take that cold hand from my wrist." The next moment the lady disappeared. One night, about the year 1880, Captain Marvel Hall and the Lieutenant Hartman were going to the rooms occupied by the former officer. As they reached a small landing, they saw distinctly in front of them a woman in a white dress. As they stood there in awestruck silence, she turned and looked towards them, showing a face beautiful enough, but colorless as a corpse, and then passed through a locked door. But it appears that this presence did not always manifest itself in as harmless a manner. Some years ago, Surgeon L. was quartered at the fort. One day he had been out snipe shooting, and as he entered the fort, the mess bugle rang out. He hastened to his rooms to dress, but as he failed to put in an appearance at the mess, one of the officers went in search of him, found him lying senseless on the floor. When he recovered consciousness, he related his experience. He said he had stooped down for the key of his door, which he had placed for safety under the mat. When in this position, he felt himself violently dragged across the hall and flung down a flight of steps. With this agrees somewhat the experience of a Captain Jarves, as related by him to Captain Marvel Hall. Attracted by a strange rattling noise in his bedroom, he endeavored to open the door of it. He found it seemingly locked. Suspecting a hoax, he called out, whereupon a gust of wind passed him, and some unseen power flung him down the stairs, and laid him senseless at the bottom. Near a seaside town in the south of Ireland, a group of small cottages was built by an old lady, in one of which she lived, while she let the others to her relatives. In process of time, all the occupants died, and the cottages fell into ruin, and were all pulled down, except the one in which the old lady had lived, the materials being used by a farmer to build a large house in which he hoped to let to summer visitors. It was shortly afterwards taken for 3 years by a gentleman for his family. It should be noted that the house had very bare surroundings. There were no trees near or outhouses where people could be concealed. Soon after the family came to the house, they began to hear raps all over it, on doors, windows, and walls. These raps varied in nature. sometimes being very like a sledgehammer, loud and dying away, and sometimes quick and sharp, 2 or 3 or 5 in succession, and all heard them. One morning about 4 a.m., the mother heard very loud knocking on the bedroom door. Thinking it was a servant wanting to go to early mass, she said, "Come in." But the knocking continued till the father was awakened by it. He got up, searched the house, but could find no one. The servant's door was slightly open, and he saw she was sound asleep. That morning a telegram came announcing the death of a beloved uncle, just about the hour of the knocking. Some time previous to this, the mother was in the kitchen, when a loud explosion took place beside her, startling her very much, but no cause for it could be found, nor were any traces left. This coincided with the death of an aunt, wife to the uncle who had died later. One night the mother went to her bedroom. The blind was drawn and the shutters closed, when suddenly a great crash came, as if a branch was thrown at the window, and there was a sound of broken glass. She opened the shutters with the expectation of finding the window smashed, but there was not even a crack in it. She entered the room next day at 1 o'clock. The same crash took place, being heard by all in the house. She went in at 10 a.m. on another day, and the same thing happened, after which she refused to enter that room again. Another night, about 11 p.m., the servant was washing up in the kitchen, when heavy footsteps were heard by the father and mother going upstairs and across the lobby to the servants' room. The father searched the house, but could find no one. After that, footsteps used to be heard regularly at that hour, though no one could ever be seen walking about. The two elderly sisters slept together, and used to see flames shooting up all over the floor, although there was no smell or heat. This used to be seen 2 or 3 times a night at a time, chiefly in one room. The first time the girls saw this, one of them got up and went to her father in alarm, naturally thinking the room underneath must be on fire. The two boys were moved to the haunted room, which one, where they slept in one large bed with its head near the chimney-piece. The elder boy, aged about 13, put his watch on the mantelpiece, awoke about 2 a.m., and wishing to ascertain the time, put his hand up for his watch. He then felt a deathly cold hand laid on his. For the rest of that night the two boys were terrified by noises, apparently caused by two people rushing about the room, fighting and knocking against the bed. About 6 a.m. they went to their father, almost in hysterics from terror, and refused to sleep there again. The eldest sister, not being nervous, was then given that room. She was, however, so disturbed by these noises that she begged her father to let her leave it. But having no other room to give her, he persuaded her to stay there, and at length she got accustomed to the noise and could sleep in spite of it. Finally the family left the house before their time was up. Mr. T.J. Westrop, to whom we are indebted for so much material, sends a tale which used to be related by a relative of his, the Reverend Thomas Westrop, concerning experiences in a house not very far from the city of Limerick. When the latter was appointed to a certain parish, he had some difficulty in finding a suitable house, but finally fixed on one which had been untenanted for many years, but had nevertheless been kept aired and in good repair, as a caretaker who lived close by used to come and look after it every day. The first night that the family settled there, as the clergyman was going upstairs, he heard a footstep and the rustle of a dress, and as he stood aside, a lady passed him, entering a door facing the stairs, and closed it after her. It was only then he realized that her dress was very old-fashioned, and that he had not been able to enter that particular room. Next day he got assistance from a carpenter who, with another man, forced open the door. A mat of cobwebs fell as they did so, and the floor and the windows were thick with dust. The men went across the room, and as the clergyman followed them, he saw a small white bird flying around the ceiling. At his exclamation, the men looked back and also saw it. It swooped, flew out of the door, and they did not see it again. After that the family were alarmed by hearing noises under the floor of that room every night. At length the clergyman had the boards taken up, and the skeleton of a child was found underneath. So old did the remains appear that the coroner did not deem it necessary to hold an inquest on them, so the rector buried them in the churchyard. Strange noises continued, as if someone were trying to force up the boards from underneath. Also a heavy ball was heard rolling down the stairs and striking against the study door. One night the two girls woke up screaming, and on the nurse running up to them, the elder said she had seen a great black dog with fiery eyes resting its paws on her bed. Her father ordered the servants to constantly sit with them in the evenings, but notwithstanding the presence of two women in the nursery, the same thing occurred. But her daughter was so scared that she never quite recovered. The family left the house immediately. The same correspondent says an old ruined house in the hills of East County, Clare, enjoyed the reputation of being desperately haunted from, at any rate, 1865 down to its dismantling. I will merely give the experiences of my own relations, as told by them to me. My mother told how one night she and my father heard creaking and grating, as if a door were being forced open. The sound came from a passage in which a door was nailed up and clamped with iron bands. A heavy footstep came down the passage and stopped at the bedroom door for a moment. No sound was heard, and then the thing came through the room to the foot of the bed. It moved round the bed, they not daring to stir. The horrible, unseen visitant stopped, and they felt it watching them. At last it moved away, and they heard it going up the passage. The door crashed, and all was silent. Lighting a candle, my father examined the room and found the door locked. He then went along the passage, but not a sound was to be heard anywhere. Strange noises like footsteps, sobbing, whispering, grim laughter, and shrieks were often heard about the house. On one occasion, my eldest sister and a girl cousin drove over to see the family and stayed the night. They and my two younger sisters were all crowded into a huge old-fashioned bed and carefully drew and tucked in the curtains all round. My eldest sister awoke feeling a cold wind blowing on her face, and putting out her hand found the curtains drawn back and, as they subsequently discovered, wedged between the bed and the wall. She reached for the matchbox and was about to light the candle when a horrible mocking laugh rang out close to the bed, which awakened the other girls. Being always a plucky woman, though then badly scared, she struck a match and searched the room, but nothing was to be seen. The closed room was said to have been deserted after a murder, and its floor was supposed to be stained with blood, which no human power could wash out. Now the blending of the fact with fiction, of which we have already spoken. The intelligent reader can decide in his own mind which is which. It is said that black magic had been practiced in this house at one time, and that the consequence, terrible and weird occurrences were quite the order of the day there. When being cooked, the hens used to scream and the mutton used to bleat in the pot. Black dogs were seen frequently. The beds used to be lifted up, and the occupants thereof used to be beaten black and blue by invisible hands. One particular ghoulish tale was told. It was said that a monk was in love with one of the daughters of the house, who was an exceedingly fat girl. She died unmarried, and was buried in the family vault. Some time later the vault was again opened for an interment, and those who entered it found that Miss D's coffin had been disturbed and the lid loosened. And then they saw that all the fat around her heart had been scooped out, apropos of ineradicable blood on the floor, which is not an infrequent item in the stories of haunted houses. It is said that a manifestation of this nature forms the haunting in a farmhouse in County Limerick. According to our informants, a light must be kept burning in this house all night. If by chance it is forgotten, or becomes quenched in the morning, the floor is covered with blood. The story is evidently much older than the house, but no traditional explanation is given. Two stories of haunted schools have been sent to us, both on very good authority. These establishments lie within the geographical limits of this chapter, but for obvious reasons we cannot indicate their locality more precisely, though the names of both are known to us. The first of these was told to our correspondent by the boy Brown, who was in the room but did not see the ghost. When Brown was about 15, he was sent to School. His brother told him not to be frightened at anything he might see or hear, as the boys were sure to play tricks on all the newcomers. He was put to sleep in a room with another new arrival, a boy named Smith, from England. In the middle of the night, Brown was roused from his sleep by Smith crying out in great alarm and asking who was in the room. Brown, who was very angry at being waked up, told him not to be a fool, that there was no one there. The second night, Smith roused him again, this time in greater alarm than the first night. He said he saw a man in cap and gown come into the room with a lamp, and then pass right through the wall. Smith got out of his bed and fell to his knees beside Brown, beseeching him not to go to sleep. At first Brown thought it was all done to frighten him, but then he saw that Smith was in a state of abject terror. The next morning they spoke of the occurrence, and the report reached the ears of the headmaster, who sent for the two boys. Smith refused to spend another night in the room. Brown said he had seen or heard nothing and was quite willing to sleep there if another fellow would sleep with him, but he would not care to remain there alone. The headmaster then asked for volunteers from the class of elder boys, but not one of them would sleep in the room. It had always been looked upon as haunted, but the master thought that by putting new boys, who had not heard the story, they would sleep there all right. Some years later, Brown revisited the place and found that another attempt had been made to occupy the room. A new headmaster who did not know its history thought it a pity to have the room idle, and put a teacher, also new to the school, in possession. When this teacher came down the first morning, he asked who had come into his room during the night. He stated that a man in a cap and gown, having books under his arm and a lamp in his hand, came in, sat down at the table, and began to read. He knew he was not one of the masters, and did not recognize him as one of the boys. The room had to be abandoned. The tradition is that many years ago a master was murdered in that room by one of the students. The few boys who had ever had the courage to persist in sleeping in the room said that if they stayed more than 2 or 3 nights, that the furniture was moved and they heard violent noises. The second story is sent to us by the recipient herself, and is therefore a first-hand experience. Considering that she was only a schoolgirl, it must be admitted that she made a most plucky attempt to run the ghost to earth. A good many years ago, when I was first to school, I did not believe in ghosts, but I then had an experience which caused me to alter my opinion. I was ordered by 2 other girls to sleep in a small top room at the back of the house which overlooked a garden which contained ancient apple trees. Suddenly in the dead of night I was awakened out of my sleep by the sound of heavy footsteps, as of a man wearing big boots, unlaced, pacing ceaselessly up and down a long corridor which I knew was plainly visible from the landing outside my door, as there was a large window at the farther end of it, and there was sufficient moonlight to enable one to see its full length. After listening for about 20 minutes, my curiosity was aroused, so I got up and stood on the landing. The footsteps still continued, but I could see nothing, although the sounds actually reached the foot of the flight of stairs which led from the corridor to the landing on which I was standing. Suddenly the footfall ceased, pausing at my end of the corridor. I then considered it was high time for me to retire, which I accordingly did, carefully closing the door behind me. To my horror, the footsteps ascended the stairs, and the bedroom door was violently dashed back against a washing stand, beside which was a bed. The contents of the ewer were spilled over the occupant, and the steps advanced a few paces into the room in my direction. A cold perspiration broke out all over me. I cannot describe the sensation. It was not actually fear. It was more that I felt I had come into contact with the unknown. What was about to happen? All I could do was speak. I cried out, "Who are you? What do you want?" Suddenly the footsteps ceased. I felt relieved and lay awake till morning. But no further sound reached my ears. How or when my ghostly visitant disappeared I never knew. Suffice it to say, my story was no nightmare, but an actual fact, of which there was found sufficient proof in the morning. The floor was still saturated with water. The door, which we always carefully closed at night, was wide open, and at last, but not least, the occupant of the wet bed had heard all that happened, but feared to speak and lay awake till morning. Naturally, we related our weird experience to our schoolmates, and it was only that I learned from one of the elder girls that this ghost had manifested itself for many years in a similar fashion to the inhabitants of that room. It was supposed to be the spirit of a man who, long years ago, had occupied this apartment. The house was then a private residence, and had committed suicide by hanging himself from an old apple tree opposite the window. Needless to say, the story was hushed up, and we were sharply spoken to, and warned not to mention the occurrence again. Some years afterwards, a friend, who happened at the time to be a boarder at this very school, came to spend a weekend with me. She related an exactly similar incident which occurred a few nights previously to her visit. My experience was quite unknown to her. The following account of strange happenings at his glebe house has been sent by the rector of a parish in the diocese of Cashel. Shortly after my wife and I came to live here, some 10 years ago, the servants complained of hearing strange noises in the top story of the rectory where they sleep. One girl ran away the day after she arrived, declaring that the house was haunted and nothing would induce her to sleep another night in it. So often had my wife to change servants on this account that at last I had to speak to the parish priest, as I suspected that the idea of ghosts might have been suggested to the maids by neighbors who might have had some interest in getting rid of them. I understood that my friend the parish priest spoke very forcibly from the altar on the subject of spirits, saying that the only spirits he believed ever did any harm to anyone were blank, mentioning a well-known brand of the wine in the country. Whether this priestly admonition was the cause or not, for some time we heard no more of tales of ghostly manifestations. After a while, however, my wife and I began to hear a noise which, while in no sense alarming, proved to be both remarkable and inexplicable. If we happen to be sitting in the dining room after dinner, sometimes we hear what sounds like the noise of a heavy coach rumbling up to the hall door. We have both heard this noise hundreds of times between 8 p.m. and midnight. Sometimes we hear it several times the same night, and then perhaps we don't hear it again for several months. We hear it best on calm nights. As we are nearly a quarter of a mile from the high road, it is difficult to account for, especially as the noise appears to be quite close to us. I mean not further away than the hall door. I may mention that an Englishman was staying with us a few years ago. As we were sitting in the dining room one night after dinner, he said, "A carriage has just driven up to the door," but we knew it was only the phantom coach, for we also heard it. Only once do I remember hearing it while sitting in the drawing room. So much for the sound of the phantom coach. But now I must tell you what I saw with my own eyes, as clearly as I see now the paper on which I am writing. Some years ago, in the middle of the summer, on a scorching hot day, I was out cutting some hay opposite the hall door just by the tennis court. It was between 12 and 1 o'clock. I remember the time distinctly, as my man had gone to his dinner shortly before. The spot on which I was commanded a view of the avenue from the entrance gate to about 400 yards. I happened to look up from my occupation, for scything is no easy work, and I saw what I took to be a somewhat high dog-cart in which two people were seated, turning in at the avenue gate. As I had my coat and waistcoat off, and was not in a state to receive visitors, I got behind a newly made haycock and watched the vehicle until it came round a bend in the avenue, where there was a clump of trees which obscured it from my view. As it did not, however, reappear, I concluded that the occupants had either stopped for some reason or had taken by mistake a cartway leading to the back gate into the garden. Hastily putting on my coat, I went down to the bend in the avenue, but to my surprise there was nothing to be seen. Returning to the rectory, I met my housekeeper, who has been with me for nearly 20 years, and I told her what I had seen. She then told me that about a month before, while I was away from home, my man had one day gone with the trap to the station. She saw, just as I did, a trap coming up the avenue until it was lost to sight owing to the intervention of the clump of trees. As it did not come on, she went down to the bend, and there was no trap to be seen. When the man came in some half hour after, my housekeeper asked him if he had come halfway up the avenue and turned back, but he said he had only that moment come straight from the station. My housekeeper said she did not like to tell me about it before, as she thought I would have laughed at her. Whether the spectral gig which I saw and the phantom coach, which my wife and I have often heard, are one and the same, I know not. But I do know that what I saw in the full blaze of the summer sun was not inspired by a dose of the spirits referred to by my friend the parish priest. Sometime during the winter of 1912, I was in the motor house one dark evening about 6 p.m. I was working at the engine, and as the car was nose in first, I was of course at the furthest point from the door. I had sent my man down to the village with a message. He had gone 10 minutes when I heard heavy footsteps enter the yard and come over to the motor house. I felt that there was someone in the house quite close to me, and I said, "Hello, blank, what brought you back so soon?" as I knew he could not have been to the village and back. As I got no reply, I took up my electric lamp and went to the back of the motor to see who was there, but there was no one to be seen. Although I searched the yard with my lamp, I could discover no one. About a week later, I heard the footsteps again under almost identical conditions, but I searched with the same futile result. Before I stop, I must tell you about a curious presentiment which happened with regard to a man I got from Queens County. He arrived on a Saturday evening, and on the following Monday morning I put him to sweep the avenue. He was at his work when I went out in the motor car at about 10:30 a.m. Shortly after I left, he left his wheelbarrow and tools on the avenue, just at the point where I saw the spectral gig disappear. And, coming up to the rectory, he told my housekeeper in a great state of agitation that he was quite sure that his brother, with whom he had always lived, was dead. He said he must return home at once. My housekeeper advised him to wait until I returned, but he changed his clothes and packed his box, saying he must catch the next train. Just before I returned home at 12 o'clock, a telegram came saying his brother had died suddenly that morning, and that he was to return at once. On my return, I found him almost in a state of collapse. He left by the next train, and I never heard of him again. K Castle is a handsome blending of ancient castle and modern dwelling house, picturesquely situated among trees, while the steep glen mentioned below runs close beside it. It has the reputation of being haunted, but, as usual, it is difficult to get information. One gentleman to whom we wrote stated that he never saw or heard anything worse than a bat. On the other hand, a lady who resided there a good many years ago gives the following account of her extraordinary experiences therein. Dear Mr. Seymour, I enclose some account of our experiences in K Castle. It would be better not to mention names, as the people occupying it have told me they are afraid of their servants hearing anything and consequently giving notice. They themselves hear voices often, but, like me, they do not mind. When first we went there we heard people talking, but on looking everywhere we could find no one. Then, on some nights, we heard fighting in the glen outside the house. We could hear voices raised in anger and the clash of steel. No person would venture out there after dusk. One night I was sitting talking with my governess. I stood up, said good night, and opened the door, which was on the top of the back staircase. As I did so, I heard someone, a woman, come slowly upstairs, walk past us to the window at the end of the landing, and then with a shriek fell heavily. As she passed it was bitterly cold, and I drew back into the room but did not say anything, as it might frighten the governess. She asked me what was the matter, as I looked so white. Without answering, I pushed her into the room and then searched the house, but with no results. Another night I was sleeping with my little girl. I awoke and saw a girl with long fair hair standing at the fireplace, one hand at her side, the other on the chimney-piece. Thinking at first it was my little girl, I felt on the pillow to see if she were gone, but she was fast asleep. There was no fire or light of any kind in the room. Some time afterwards a friend was sleeping there, and she told me that she was pushed out of bed the whole night. Two gentlemen to whom I had mentioned this came over, thinking they would find out the cause. In the morning when they came down, they asked for the carriage to take them to the next train, but would not tell what they had seen or heard. Another person who came to visit her sister, who was looking after the house before we went in, slept in this room, and in the morning said she must go back that day. She also would give no information. On walking down the corridor, I heard a door open, a footstep cross before me, and go into another room, both doors being closed at the time. An old cook I had told me that when she went into the hall in the morning, a gentleman would come down the front stairs and take a plumed hat off the stand and vanish through the hall door. This she saw nearly every morning. She also said that a girl often would come into her bedroom and put her hand on her, the cook's, face, and when she would push her away, she would hear the girl's voice say, "Oh, don't," 3 times. I've often heard voices in the drawing room, which decidedly sounded as if an old gentleman and a girl were talking. Noises like furniture being moved were frequently heard at night, and strangers staying with us have often asked why the servants turned out the rooms underneath them at such an unusual hour. The front door bell sometimes rang, and I have gone down, but found no one. Yours very sincerely, F.T. Kilman Castle, in the heart of Ireland, the name is obviously a pseudonym, has been described as perhaps the worst haunted mansion in the British Isles. That it deserves this doubtful recommendation we cannot say, but at all events the ordinary reader will be prepared to admit that it contains sufficient ghosts to satisfy the most greedy ghost hunter. A couple of months ago, The present writer paid a visit to this castle and was shown all over it one morning by the mistress of the house, who, under the nom de plume of Andrew Mary, has published novels dealing with Irish life, and has also contributed articles on the ghostly phenomenon of her house to the Occult Review. The place itself is a grim, gray, bare building. The central portion, in which is the entrance hall, is a square castle of the usual type. It is built on rock, and a slight batter from base to summit gives it an added appearance of strength and solidity. On the other side of the castle are more modern wings, one of which terminates in what is known as the priest's house. Now to the ghosts. The top story of the central tower is a large, well-lighted apartment called the chapel, having evidently served that purpose in times past. At one end is what is said to be an oubliette, now almost filled up. Occasionally, in the evenings, people walking along the roads or in the fields see the windows of this chapel lighted up for a few seconds as if many lamps were suddenly brought into it. This is certainly not due to servants. From our experience, we can testify that it is the last place on earth that a domestic would enter after dark. It is also said that a treasure is buried somewhere in or around the castle. The legend runs that an ancestor was about to be taken to Dublin on a charge of rebellion, and, fearing he would never return, made the best of the time left to him by burying somewhere a crock full of gold and jewels. Contrary to expectation, he did return, but his long confinement had turned his brain, and he could never remember the spot where he had deposited his treasure years before. Some time ago, a lady, a Miss B, who was decidedly psychic, was invited to Kilman Castle in the hope that she would be able to locate the whereabouts of this treasure. In this respect she failed, unfortunately, but gave, nevertheless, a curious example of her power. As she walked through the halls with her hostess, she suddenly laid her hand upon the bare stone wall and remarked, "There is something uncanny here, but I don't know what it is." In that very spot, some time previously, 2 skeletons have been discovered walled up. The sequel to this is curious. Some time after, Miss B was either trying automatic writing or else was at a séance, we forget which, when a message came to her from the unseen, stating that the treasure of Kilman Castle was concealed in the chapel under the tessellated pavement near the altar. But this spirit was either a lying spirit or else a most impish one, for there was no trace of an altar, and it is impossible to say, from the style of the room, where it stood, while the tessellated pavement, if it exists, is so covered with the debris of the former roof that it would be impossible to have it thoroughly cleaned. There is as well a miscellaneous assortment of ghosts. A monk with a tonsure and cowl walks in at one window of the priest's house and out another. There is also a little old man dressed in the antique garb of a green cutaway coat, knee breeches, and buckled shoes. He is sometimes accompanied by an old lady in similar old-fashioned costume. Another ghost has a penchant for lying on the bed beside its lawful and earthly occupant. Nothing is seen, but a great weight is felt and a consequent deep impression made on the bedclothes. The lady of the house states that she has a number of letters from friends in which they relate the supernatural experiences they had while staying at the castle. In one of these, the writer, a gentleman, was awakened one night by an extraordinary feeling of intense cold at his heart. He then saw in front of him a tall female figure, clothed from head to foot in red, and its right hand raised menacingly in the air. The light which illuminated the figure was from within. He lit a match and sprang out of bed, but the room was empty. He went back to bed and saw nothing more that night, except that several times the same cold feeling gripped his heart, though to the touch the flesh was quite warm. But of all the ghosts in that well-haunted house, the most unpleasant is that inexplicable thing that is usually called it. The lady of the house described to the present writer her personal experience of this phantom. High up round one side of the hall runs a gallery which connects some of the bedrooms. One evening she was in this gallery, leaning on the balustrade and looking down into the hall. Suddenly she felt 2 hands laid on her shoulders. She turned around and saw it standing close beside her. She described it as being human in shape and about 4 feet high. The eyes were like 2 black holes in the face, and the whole figure seemed as if it were made of gray cotton wool, while it was accompanied by the most appalling stench, such as would come from a decaying human body. The lady got a shock from which she did not recover for a long time. The end.